Chair. This is a question to both witnesses, if that's okay. The question I've got is about the preparation with regards to the impact on wider society and how much that was considered. For example, with schools, if this had have been a flu-based pandemic, I would imagine schools would have been hit even harder. You know, children would have been having this, teachers would have been having it. Similarly, in the business and the workplace, a lot more people off sick who are younger, not just isolating. And I'm just interested to get your views on how much that wider impact of these things are looked into, because actually a lot of the issues this year have been behavioural, but also the impact on just daily life beyond the pandemic itself, the coronavirus itself.
So if I start, I think what you're bringing up is not only science, but also our priorities. Should our priorities be the young or going to school or whatever? Because how you respond depends on those priorities. For flu, and I'm sure Sir Mark will come back to it, there's been a lot of modelling and debate about whether to close schools or not. And last time I was aware of it, back in 2016, we decided that we wouldn't close schools, even though it would transmit very quickly. Here, in COVID, we didn't know what was happening in schools, and therefore it was a perfectly reasonable response until you discover that it's actually not transmitting that much in schools, and our priority has to be the young, their education, and getting them jobs.
Dean? Sir Mark.
To pick up that point, the challenge really is that the vulnerability of different parts of the population varies according to the infection. And so if you go back to the 1918 flu pandemic, which killed more people than were killed in the First World War, the young turned out to be particularly vulnerable, and the elderly were less vulnerable, possibly because they had pre-existing immunity to similar influenza infections from the past. And so you just basically have to work out with each particular virus. In many cases, the young are very potent sources of transmission. In the case of this coronavirus, it turns out that basically adolescents and older children are as susceptible to the infection, though not to the adverse effects of the infection, but getting infected as other adults. Very young children seem to be infected rather less. But you learn with every different infection, and to some extent you just have to, in a sense, you have to do scenario planning. In other words, and I was picking up a point that Sally made, if you only limit yourself when you plan scenarios to one particular infection, then you, as it were, work on a particular set of vulnerabilities. So one should probably have a menu of different viral or other infection scenarios. And I think Sally's point about antimicrobial resistance is important because, of course, previously there have been pandemics, things like the Black Death, which were bacterial rather than viral. And at the moment, the likelihood of a bacterial pandemic has been much, much lower. But with antimicrobial resistance, it could go up. And so streptococcal disease, which was never a pandemic as such, but which caused a lot of deaths in earlier generations, could come back as a problem. But I think, in a nutshell, it's about to have different scenarios to plan against.
And can I just ask very briefly, in terms of the preparedness for this year, was the preparation in place for those different scenarios for schools and so on the different potential pandemics that were possible? Coronavirus, I appreciate, was novel, but it's still, there were forms of it that had occurred previously in other areas. So was the preparation in place at the end of last year for what has happened this year in broad terms?
No, we're prepared for flu.
Okay, thank you.